storyteller for a project that we painted here at Baruch during the springtime. Some of you in this class had the opportunity to also participate in that mural painting process and probably came across her portrait as well. But if this is the first time, right, you had the opportunity to listen a little bit about her story and how she has made a life in Mexico with her children who were born in the U.S. but are now being raised in Mexico, and just her efforts in continuing to uplift stories like her own, right? People that might have grown up in the U.S. but unfortunately faced deportation as adults. But what happens to the family unit? How do you also still be a mother across borders, right? So how is it that you also can empower yourself, right? And tell your story that has helped so many people connect with her story, right? So this is how I found her. I remember it was a YouTube video back in the day, a couple of years ago. And I was on TikTok one day working on the mural project. And I was like, oh my God, why didn't I think of her right away, right? So I reached out through Instagram, I think, and TikTok, and she answered right away. So this is how these connections happen, right? Like if she wouldn't tell her story on social media, then we wouldn't be here right now. But and then again, if she wouldn't tell her story on social media, other people going through the same situation wouldn't feel like their stories matter or they're visible, right? So there's a lot of power and courage in doing so. There's a lot of criticism as well, but at the end of the day, you're doing it for you and it's helping someone else, so that's what matters, right? So I'll leave the floor for Anna to tell us a little bit more about her story and just, anything that she feels comfortable in sharing with us. So thank you, Anna, for being with us.
Okay, I'm winging this, so I did not prepare.
I'll record it and I'll send it to you.
Recording in progress.
Sounds good. So yeah, just like Liz said, I started sharing my story on social media around 2021. I was deported in 2018 under the Trump administration. I was a single mother to 5 children that were all born in the U.S. And I had been in the U.S. since I was about 5. I was taken over there by my parents. I was a legal permanent resident, aka green card holder. I committed several crimes that were considered crimes of moral turpitude under immigration law. And because of that, I was ultimately deported. I became a deportation priority under the Trump administration. The crimes that I committed were, they have all these fancy names, but I stole money from several of my employers. So I was charged with several felonies, and when Trump went into office, all of us became deportation priorities, but specifically people like me that had felonies or crimes that were considered aggravated crimes under immigration law. Because of the dollar amount of the loss to my victims, my crime under immigration law was classified aggravated, which put me in the same category as the violent offenders, the rapists, the murderers, the kidnappers, all of those. So because of that, I was subject to mandatory detention, meaning that once ICE detained me, if I wanted to fight for some type of immigration relief, I would have to wait in immigration jail, which can be 2 to 3 years. It really was a gamble. At the time that I was detained, I had a very small baby. She was about 7 months old. I was nursing her. And in my desperation to get back to her and to reunite with all of my kids as soon as possible, I opted not to fight my deportation case, and I signed. I was picked up by ICE on February 1st, and in 10 days I was on a flight back to Mexico, where I hadn't been since I was 4 or 5. So the transition was very traumatic, very quick. I didn't really have time to prepare mentally, emotionally, financially. There were no opportunities for me or my family to make any type of arrangements for me to land in Mexico. So the deportation process itself, in my opinion, was very, not just inhumane, but processed in a way that really puts us at risk once we reach the other side of the border. We are literally dropped off with whatever we are picked up with. Some people are picked up with nothing. And so there were people that I was deported with that literally had nothing but the clothes on their back when we reached the border. I was fortunate enough, I had my mother that was very insistent with ICE, and she was able to somehow manage for them to deport me with a small luggage that contained essentials, cash, and a cell phone that was on 10% battery by the time I turned it on in Mexico. And with that, I was able to make one phone call to my mom. Arrangements were made. I was flown into Puerto Vallarta, and that's where I've resided since then. I'm going on my 7th year here. And I was not reunited with my kids very quickly. That was a whole nother phase of my journey. When I signed my deportation order, one of the promises that I've made to me is if I signed my order, I would be reunited with them fairly quickly. I recall them telling me within a week, your family can send your kids over to you. It took me a year, and because by the time that I reached Mexico, I then had to go through another judicial process with the family courts in Utah to allow my children to relocate because they were also U.S. citizens. They had fathers up there with legal rights. And so it took me a year. Eventually, I started with my younger two, and eventually my oldest three followed. And we have all been here as a family unit for 3 years now. I believe we're going on our fourth. And so they now reside here. They are now, ironically, child immigrants, but backwards. So I went up there when I was a child, and they came down here around the same, some of them around the same age. And so they then had to adapt to the language, the culture, school. They fly back and forth now to visit family and their dads up in the U.S., and they reside with me for the entire school year. And that was kind of where I started sharing my story was, after I had retained custody of my kids, I got on social media. I made a quick TikTok, really just to make it for my account. I didn't think it would go viral. It did go viral. It gained a lot of questions, and people were curious, how could this happen? What about your kids? And one thing led to another, and I grew a very sizable platform by just sharing my story very candidly, talking openly about my crimes, my experience, the whole custody issue. And I've been doing this for about, I believe, 3 years now. I incorporated a series on my YouTube channel where I interview other people who have been deported and share their stories through my platform, because I have felt that they need to be heard. I believe we all kind of feel like once we're deported, we're forgotten about. There's no real studies done. There's no statistics. Nobody really knows what happens to us. And because of that, a lot of people that are facing deportation or have, some type of immigration issue, we view Mexico as this dark place with no hope, no future, no way of life, because we're taught in the U.S. that everybody's dying to go into the U.S., which a lot of people are for various reasons, but there's also life on the side of the border, which is what I have tried to convey through my social media platform to other people like me that may face deportation, that may choose to relocate. Some of them may choose to abandon their immigration case and just come back home to start over. So that's kind of where I met Liz earlier this year, and I was honored to be a part of the Mural project. Ironically, Ciudad, Juarez is where I was dropped off in 2018. So for my mural to go, or for my picture to go on that mural, was very significant for me, very much a full circle healing moment. I was able to take my children with me on the project, and so they took part in painting the mural and getting our story up there. My oldest daughter is now 16. She gave a couple interviews, and I've slowly started to kind of see, their own stories form. Because deportation has this ripple effect, right? That doesn't just affect the person deported, it goes out into our families, the community, taxpayers, etc. And so that is what I've been trying to shine a light on through my content, particularly for people that have very little knowledge of what goes on behind the scenes after you vote, what goes on behind the scenes after ICE detains us and deports us. So yeah, that's a little bit of my summary. If you have any questions, the floor is yours, Liz.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, and I'll make sure to share your social media as well, just so they could see, how it has evolved, right, throughout, the years. And I know some people that are joining through Zoom are also people that follow you, right, and just support you since you started telling your story. So questions that you might have, we could start, and hopefully we could ask her. Yes, then?
The new environment. I know you said it was a drastic change, right? If they just deport you and then they don't give you more resources or anything like that to help with the process.
Okay.
I was just wondering how is it adapting?
So the question is, just because we're so far away, how is it adapting to Mexico, right? Specifically, like you mentioned, right? Like, there's no resources provided for you. There's really no one kind of guiding you through the process. Like, how was that adaptation or returning back to Mexico for you?
It was traumatic because the way I describe it, I felt like I was just thrown into a dark hole, right? I didn't understand the money, the exchange rate, the way of life. Although I spoke Spanish, my Spanish wasn't that great. So it was scary. I remember arriving to the border that morning, and we had just heard nothing but horror stories about Juarez and women getting kidnapped and the cartel and the taxis are in on it. So it was really scary. There are no, and if there are, I didn't have any knowledge of any resources or anybody that would guide us really. So I had to rely on my family that lived in the U.S. And although they weren't here with me, they provided a lot of the support that was imperative in me surviving really those first few weeks, from booking my airplane tickets to booking my hotel room, and really just talking to me through it on the phone. But other than that, it was really lonely. It was really lonely, and that's one of the topics that I like to shine light on, because not all of us have family on the other side. I feel like I was very fortunate. My family are all naturalized citizens, so they were able to come and go. They had that, privilege to be able to help me and come down. My sister eventually flew down with a lot of my belongings, etc. But there's a lot of us that don't have that, and we really are alone. There's all of us will experience homelessness after deportation, whether it's for a night or 2 or 3 or 4, because there is no, through the process of deportation, we are not told when we're getting deported, how or what day, so our families can't even make arrangements for us to be picked up at the border. So all those little details, are the ones that I try to get out there that I really believe deserve change. Not just to humanize the deportation, but to avoid making us a target and a risk. Really, it's a safety risk for us to just be dropped off with nothing. If you think about it, even the people that are paroled out of jail and prison for many years, they are given some type of resource to the halfway house or cash or something. Where deportees don't get any of that. We are just dropped off and left to our luck.
Yeah, thank you for sharing this. And definitely, right, like you mentioned, there's really hardly any knowledge about what happens to people when they get deported. But it's evident, right, once you're at the border specifically and you see it, right? And then, like you said, not everyone has family, right, or the resources to send money, arrange for someone to pick you up, or to have a place to stay. So homelessness, unfortunately, becomes one of the big issues, aside from like being targeted, right? Any other questions that you might have?
Couldn't you started at the beginning of that, like how she reported it?
Oh yeah, so at the beginning there is, because we would have issues at the beginning here. So for having a criminal record, you could get deported, even as a permanent resident. Criminal record? Yeah. Sorry. Any other questions that you might have?
I just want to say how she dealt with it, that she comes with it. And I feel like it's exile.
Yeah, so if you could talk a little bit more about like the feelings that you felt right after facing deportation, like how did you navigate these feelings or emotions that might have come from being forced out of the U.S.?
It does come with a lot of shame, especially in my situation where I felt like I was one of the fortunate ones that did have residency. I was documented, I had papers, right? And so it came with a lot of shame, embarrassment, and I didn't talk about it openly. When I got to Mexico, I was very private about, why I was in Mexico, and it wasn't something that I was entirely comfortable talking about. But once I started seeing that there was a lot more of us out here, some of the first people that I met had also been deported, and I would talk to them, and one of the first questions whenever you meet another English speaker is, what brings you to PV? So eventually, little by little, I started just kind of saying, well, I got deported. And the more that I talked about it, the more that it kind of became normal, at least in my world, to say this is why I'm here. When I got on social media, I think was the turning point for me, where I made peace with some of that shame, and I felt like I paid my debt to society. I don't deserve to live in the shadows anymore. And I know that there's so many people like me that still live in the shadow with that guilt, with that embarrassment of the exile, of being literally just thrown out of the country. And, so I think eventually just with your mindset, you make peace with it. And once I started learning more and like hearing about other stories and the people that I met through, ICE detention, there were army wives in there. There were people in there with no criminal records, and it still happened to them. that I started to not take it as personal, that it is just something very, at least in my opinion, it's a flawed immigration system. And in a way, I saw it as also as painful as it was, I was set free from the system. I spent a lot of years battling the courts and for several different issues, but I began to feel like life here was a little bit more free. And it was a chance to start over, fresh, clean slate. I no longer carried that weight of the felon label, the criminal, the illegal alien label that they slap on us up there. I started to kind of feel like this is home, this is where I belong all along.
Okay, thank you for sharing this, and definitely, right, like you mentioned, like the aspect of like who also gets deported, right? It's people with no criminal record also, right? Army wives, or like military wives also get deported. So I mean, there's so many people. So at the end of the day, it's like anyone.
Veterans, yeah, Marine veterans that have been deported, people that have served.
Yeah, so people have served the country, right? Question.
So how was it explaining to them what was happening and trying to get them to understand the circumstances? I know it's a pretty tough conversation to have with just anyone when I had, such young kids to even part of the conversation.
Yeah, so the question is, how did you explain this whole process to your children, right? Like, how did you even navigate this conversation with them? Because you had kids at different ages, right? And a newborn as well. So how did you even tell them, like, hey, this is what's happening?
That's probably the hard part of my story to talk about, is I talk about how it impacted my children. My oldest kids were 8 to 9. So they were, able to kind of, one day I just didn't come home. And because it happened so suddenly and I wasn't expecting it and it happened so fast, I actually didn't get to have that conversation with them. I didn't get to explain. I didn't get to say goodbye. I was just removed overnight like that. That conversation unfortunately landed on my mother. And once I got here, we had conversations through the phone, and because everything was so uncertain at the time, I really didn't have an explanation for them. Before my deportation, I was very open with them as I was going through my criminal proceedings in childlike terms, that there was a possibility that I could do prison time. And, I explained to them the best as I could that I had made mistakes and I had to answer for them and there could possibly be some punishment. And because I had had these conversations with them, I feel like it kind of prepped them a little bit for when the deportation happened, although none of us were expecting it. And initially in those first few weeks, all I could really tell them was, it's going to be okay, but I didn't know how. I didn't know when I could bring them, if they would come down, when they would be able to visit. I didn't know where I was going to live, where I was going to work. So I did not have that conversation with them. Really, we all kind of winged it. My mom really took the brunt of that, dealing with the emotional side with them as I was trying to just kind of stay afloat out here. And eventually, as things, kind of panned out and I brought them down for the first visit a year later, we started to make peace with the fact that I'm going to live down here and you're going to live up there, because I don't have I don't have the passport that you guys have to be able to go up there, and so they started to kind of, okay, mom doesn't have this, mom doesn't have that, and so these visits became part of our normal life, just coming down to see mom. And then eventually when COVID happened, we made a decision to transition them down here full time. And I had always told them that the most important thing, even prior to my deportation, is that we are together, regardless of where we are together. We struggled, me as a single mother, being able to provide. Sometimes we would have to move a lot or move back into my mom's basement. So my mantra for them was always, the most important thing is that we are together. So when I couldn't keep that, when I could no longer embody that for them through my deportation, that was a hard hit. But within a couple years of us doing the back and forth thing, I transitioned them again with that same, reiterating that to them, that family is the most important, and no matter where we are, whether we are in Mexico or Utah or in Egypt somewhere, as long as we are together, we can make a home. And that's kind of how I started to kind of coach them through their transition because it was difficult, particularly for my oldest daughter. And fast forward to 3-4 years, they're thriving, they're doing great, they adapted to the language, the culture, they're used to going back and forth, and now I like to think that they get the best of both worlds by being able to travel into the US, and learn about their roots, their culture, and really grow up with the Mexican side of, where they come from.
Yeah, thank you for sharing this, because I think it's important, right, to also, and I think you mentioned something so important, right? You migrated to the U.S. as a young kid, and now your children are also now migrating towards Mexico now as children, right? So you do understand how that could feel, right? Because you also experienced it yourself, right? But now it's now you're the mom, right? So it's like, how do you help them in navigating this? And it's not easy, right? Any other questions? Probably like close to the last question that you might have. What other questions come up? What other questions might you have? It's a lot to digest as well, right? So maybe I could ask you, right? I know your oldest daughter just turned 15, right? But
16.
moving forward in a couple of years, right?
Yes.
Do they plan to go back to the U.S., meaning like once they're of age, do they plan to go to college out here? Have they even talked about it or expressed any like sentiments towards saying, hey, I might just go back for a couple of years and come back? Or what is it that they might have expressed?
So I always thought that they would, and that was a really heavy thing for me to carry, that eventually they will return because they're American citizens and all the best things are up in the U.S. Ironically, my oldest daughter, she's just turned 16, and we're now, she's in high school, and college is around the corner, and she wants to study in Guadalajara. And I've had a lot of conversations about, will you eventually, where do you think you will live? And she has said she wants to live in Mexico. She feels more Mexican than American at this point, and she identifies more with this side of the border. As you know, we are also in the process of a U visa. And so I have always, told them, we take 1 year at a time because things can change like that. And anytime I mention the idea of returning to the U.S., my kids don't want to return. And, they're like, well, this is over there, and I don't know. And, they don't have, I always thought that they belonged up there, right? That they're American citizens, and I had brought them down here because I was deported. But in the few years that they have spent here, their roots have grown pretty quickly to where this is home for them now. And I kind of reverse it. When I was a child and I was taken up there around that age, I don't think I would have returned to Mexico either, because your childhood is kind of what forms you, and so those really important years for them are being spent here in Mexico, to where this has become where they want to stay, at least for now. My son is 13, and he has expressed some interest in joining the military. He hasn't told me which one, if he wants to be Mexican military or U.S. military, but I think as they start to, develop more into their high school years up here, he'll have a better direction. But right now, they don't express a desire to return to the U.S.
Okay, and that's very interesting, right? Like you mentioned, right? And I think it kind of follows the story of your narrative, right? Home is where my children are, right? So that might also impact, right, with this feeling of like having them far away. But it's very interesting, right, how they also now feel more Mexican than, from the U.S. kind of thing. And it has to do, right, like coming of age in Mexico has that impact. So maybe we could close up with like just your plans for the future, right? Like you're doing multiple things. You also have your own businesses. Like, how do you imagine life moving forward in the next couple of months for you? Like, what plans might you have that you feel comfortable sharing?
I think right now just on the same road, continuing to spread awareness on social media, share my story, continuing to share other stories. Right now, I'm really interested in continuing this series on YouTube, where I'm putting other deportation stories on there. And so that is kind of my focus is, I do a lot of different things on my platforms, but that has always been kind of like the front and center of pushing these stories out. And, for my children to just continue to provide for them, to lead them, guide them, and start, encouraging them to use their little voices too, because I feel like their stories are important. Everything that they went through as a result of this deportation and immigration process needs to be heard up, one day. I feel like the children that go through these really traumatic family separations are really the future in ensuring that there is some type of change, so that in the future kids like them are not ripped from their parents so traumatically.
Yeah, and unfortunately, right, like you mentioned, like their stories will connect with someone else because there's so many people who have gone through the same thing, right, or will be going through it as well. And we don't know how the next couple of years or months are gonna look like, depending on what happens in November. So just kind of keeping that in mind, right? Like humanizing again the stories and remembering that these are people that we're talking about and talking to as well. So I want to thank you again for your time, and I'll be in touch again soon. I'll send the recording as well. But we really appreciate your time and just you being very vulnerable and sharing your story with us again, even through Zoom, even at a distance.
Thank you for having me. It was an honor. I hope you took something away from it.
Oh yeah, thank you so much.